Good evening and welcome. My name is Noah Rauch. I'm the Senior Vice President for Education and Public Programs here at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, Turkey at a Crossroads, the 2023 Earthquake, Election, and Centennial. As always, I'd like to extend a special welcome to our museum members and to those tuning in to our live web broadcast. On February 6th, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake struck northern Syria and southern Turkey, killing over 49,000 people and displacing millions. The tragedy exposed pitfalls in Turkey's political system and the state of the country, both in the lead up to the upcoming election being held next month and in the shadow of the Turkish Centennial, which is being marked this year. To talk through these overlapping events, Turkey's recent history, and what the future may hold, we are honored to be joined by Soli Ozel, Professor of International Relations at Kadir Has University in Istanbul. In addition to being a senior lecturer there, Soli writes for a variety of Turkish and American publications and is a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, he was a Bernstein Fellow at the Shell Center for Human Rights at Yale Law School and a visiting lecturer at the Political Science Department of Yale. He's held fellowships at Oxford, the EU Institute of Strategic Studies, and was a Fisher Family Fellow at the Belfer Center of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He has guest lectured at Georgetown, Harvard, Tufts, and other American universities. He's also taught at UC Santa Cruz, Go Banana Slugs, SAIS, University of Washington, Northwestern University, Hebrew University, Boğaziçi University, the Paris Institute of Political Studies, and Yale. Soli, thank you for joining us this evening and for sharing your insights. I will now turn things over to the 9/11 Memorial Museum's Director, Clifford Chanin.
Thank you, Noah. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I want to start just on a personal note. We met, I'd say, over 30 years ago.
Yeah.
I was, in a previous life, going to Turkey with some frequency for work-related matters, and I needed to understand what was going on there. And it's a fascinating country, by the way, for those of you who haven't been. You might put it on your list because it's a beautiful country. The people are wonderful. We'll talk about the complications of politics now, but separate and apart from all of that, it really is a wonderful place. But I was going frequently, and it's a complicated country, and you need somebody to help you understand what's going on. And that's how I originally met Soli. And in the years since, he has continued to explain Turkey to us outsiders, but also has a remarkable following inside Turkey as well. So Soli, it's wonderful to see you.
I'm very happy to be here.
And so we'll talk about the election, which is obviously a critical moment coming next month. But you also note 2023 is the 100th year marking the founding of the Turkish Republic.
Yes.
And that itself is an extremely complicated moment that has enormous ramifications for Turkey today. And so Turkey coming out of this history as the Ottoman Empire, this dominant imperial power, shrinking down in the aftermath of World War I to borders that were compressed by the victorious Allies. And so the change in politics there was such that you have this idea of a national state that has aspirations towards developing in a Western way, yet still a very nationalistic view of itself that's not particularly open to outside influence. So talk to us a little bit about the current state of thinking about what Turkey should be and how that factors into the politics.
Okay, thank you. Well, for those of you who are not very familiar, very briefly, as Cliff said, Turkey is the legatee of the Ottoman Empire. That was the core territory of the empire left. But of course, the First World War didn't just end the Ottoman Empire, it also ended the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It also ended the Russian Empire, but the Russian Empire in a way has been reconstituted by the Bolsheviks as the Soviet Union. Of course, just like every other newly emerging country, Turkey had a state-forming and nation-building project. And that nation-building project continued a trend that actually had begun in the last decades of the Ottoman Empire, to modernize, to create a modern state, and make sure that the empire and then the republic afterwards would be part of the European power structure. So one of the paradoxes and one of the inner conflicts of the Republican identity is that you gain your independence and your legitimacy is a function of the fight against the West, but it is the Western world that you wish to join, both in strategic terms and in terms of the way you organize your economy, politics, and society. That was a valiant effort. If you will, the Turkish Republic's experiment was hailed as a big experiment, and there was something called the Turkish model, the original Turkish model. We had since then 2 other Turkish models. And that Turkish model also reflected a bit of Orientalism because, a predominantly Muslim country trying to modernize along Western lines, and secular and all that, as if such countries or such populations were incapable of that. That was really hailed. And in the aftermath of the Second World War, Turkey also had its wish to become strategically a part of the West, and that settled. Then, of course, sociology takes its role. Villages empty, people go to urban areas. A more conservative, zeitgeist, if you will, emerges. More conservative people not sharing the original goals in the way the Republican founders have conceived of it. But Turkey also democratized in 1915. By the way, for those of you who are unfamiliar, we will have our elections on the 14th of May. And 14th of May is an important date in Turkish political history because it was on the 14th of May 1950 that we had our first truly fair and free election. And of course, power changed hands. So both the opposition and the rulers of the country today claim that day as their own symbolic power day, if you will. And in between, we had several military interventions, directly or indirectly, but we managed to hold elections regularly when the military were not around, and those were free and fair until recently. So today, the original cleavages of the Turkish Republic are still with us. One is between religious conservatism versus modernist secularism. So the religious secular cleavage. The other one, the ethnic one, Kurdish Turkish. And the third one, which has been always present but not necessarily a very dominant one, between authoritarianism and democracy. And I would argue that in the upcoming elections, along with the other 2 cleavages, the authoritarian democratic cleavage is going to be present, and it may be even the more important cleavage over which we're going to be seeing this particular election being fought.
So the election itself has 2 principal candidates against one another. One, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has been in power for 20 plus years in Turkey. Under this time, he has essentially changed the system. It has allowed the presidency to become omnipotent, essentially. It has incorporated control over the judiciary and large parts of the media into his structure, but it's a very personalized structure. It's not particularly a state-oriented structure. And he's opposed now by a candidate who represents 6 opposition parties who unusually have come together so that they don't dilute the opposition. And you mentioned Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, and he is now the representative of all the opposition hopes, whether they're liberally secular oriented, whether they're
or Kurdish nationalists.
Kurdish nationalists. And so tell us a bit about Erdogan, because he seems to be setting the agenda one way or the other, 20 years in power. will certainly do that. And where is he now in his career? What has he accomplished? And where are his vulnerabilities in this election?
He may yet win the election, but I think it's the twilight of his career. And Erdogan has been one of the most consequential political leaders that Turkey has ever seen. In that, first of all, he comes from a political tradition, a political movement whose self-identification was formed in opposition to the secular Republican project. And I raised this question, I mentioned it to you earlier, the fact that a movement and its political representative that was founded on rejecting the premises of the new republic, their coming to power, is that a victory of the republic or is it a defeat of the republic? Democratically speaking, I think it is a victory of the republic, although one may disagree with that. And secondly, even after 20 years, the fact that we do have that authoritarian democratic cleavage and that the democratic side of that cleavage is on the rise. And the 6 million, most of the 6 million new voters that are going to be voting for the first time in these elections identify themselves not as religiously motivated, but as secular nationalists, tells you something about the force of societal change over political, ideological repression or domination. So Erdogan came to the national scene when he got elected the mayor of Istanbul, Turkey's largest city, its economic center. 32% of taxes are paid by Istanbul residents. He was an important and very capable political personality. He was the one who actually mobilized conservative women to canvass during campaigns, and that was a major success. And then, as you said, he was put in jail. That made him even more popular. And ultimately, when in 2002, we had another parliamentary elections, he could not run because he was jailed before. The Justice and Development Party, AKP, he was leading, won the elections, mostly because the existing Turkish regime has ultimately collapsed. It's actually collapsed. It was rotten, it collapsed, and it was a rejection of the existing order in the country. And at the time, the entire world was presumably going to become democratic. It was the end of history times, as you recall. And Turkey was trying to join the European Union. So the European Union's reforms, civilianizing Turkish polity, reducing the role of the military, actually eliminating the role of the military in Turkish politics, administrative reform, women's rights, rule of law, on all of those things, of course, Turkey made a lot of progress in the first 6-7 years of the AKP rule. And it served them, I mean, this was partially in order to be able to qualify to start negotiations with the European Union. And also all these reforms for joining the European Union also consolidated civilian rule and of course gave protection to an Islamist party that was in power and that was opposed by established entities of the Turkish Republican structure. Then after 2008, the winds have shifted not just in Turkey, but in the rest of the world as well. And when I teach a course now on the rise of authoritarianism and the decline of liberal democracy, question mark. The question mark is to protect yourself, you see. So Turkey gradually began to move away from that democratizing path and became one of the models, if you will, for what is now being called either competitive authoritarianism or electoral authoritarianism, the samples of which can be found nowadays, I think, in India or in Hungary. And if January 6 succeeded, you would have said in the United States as well. and there are other places in the world as such. So the beginning of AKP rule and where we are today are really very different from one another. And it appears to me that Erdogan, who still has a substantial following, he has devotees, he certainly polls over 40%, head-to-head nowadays with the opposition candidate, and his party still commands about 32% support, has not lost all his attraction. But as I said, I find that this is the twilight for both him and his party, which by now, in the early periods of the campaign, could not really come up with a new vision or a brighter future, and not to mention the fact that for the last 4 years, Turkey's economy has been sinking. Our inflation rate sets world records. People are getting impoverished. Income distribution is awful. And then, of course, as you said at the very beginning, and I would emphasize, I would underline the importance of it, the earthquake and the absence of the state when people were in need have really transformed the image and the prestige of the
So let me read you from your own notes, because I think it summarizes very well. You say the earthquakes were a turning point in the politics of the country.
Yeah.
And so had the earthquake not happened, one could imagine this as a normal election where the incumbent would have the advantage and might easily win.
Yeah.
But you're right. If nothing else, the need for administrative and political restoration has been recognized by all. The quakes displayed two realities about Turkey. The first was the absence of an effective state. Institutions have been hollowed out, and many are being run by people whose main, if not only qualification, is their subservience to the top and their loyalty to the chief. The second, and definitely more uplifting reality, stemmed from Turkish society. The entire country mobilized to help the victims because the state had failed them.
It was amazing.
And donations went to voluntary organizations and not state agencies, since the former were more trusted than the latter. The Turkish Red Crescent, you write, whose job it is to provide everything that's necessary in such a moment of catastrophe, actually sold tents and other necessary items to volunteer organizations. On the other hand, this scandal did not budge those responsible from their positions. Typically for this government, not a single official resigned as a result of the defective and negligent performance of state authorities. So again, if the earthquake doesn't happen, it's easy to see a continued path for Erdogan. How much do you put on a public reckoning with the last 20 years because of the failures around the earthquake?
It's really very hard to gauge. I mean, we have polls, but 2 million people, first of all, have moved out of the region. The earthquake hit 11 provinces, about a population of 13.5 million, representing 16% of Turkish population, about 9 to 10% of its GDP. 2 million people have left the place, and they don't really have any residents left any longer. Some people are living in tents, some people are living in container houses. And it's evident that the state really failed in helping them. But I don't know if we can get in such a short period of time the exact reflection of their disappointments, disillusions, anger, resentments about what did not happen as well as what had happened. We'll see probably when the elections take place. Of course, it will be a problem to register those who survived, and if they move to another part of the country, how they're going to register and vote and all that. So far, in the rest of the country, the earthquake didn't seem to have made as big a dent as I would have expected. But whether or not the people tell the pollsters exactly how they feel, that also I cannot really be sure about. But there is no doubt that modern Turkey, that is the more modernized parts of Turkey, where the bulk of the urban population live. This was noted, this was registered, and they were already turning against a government that didn't seem to have their interests at heart, especially economically. I mean, when the Americans complain about, I don't know, a 5% inflation, we find it risible because that's our monthly inflation rate, if it's on a good month, by the way. And we don't, and the problem is, of course, because the administration is not terribly credible any longer, we don't trust the figures either. So I guess the earthquake will have an impact, negative impact for the government, but fully what it will be, I don't know. For the moment, what I see is the opposition has a much better chance in these elections than it has had in the previous elections. It's going to be a tough race. Mr. Erdogan can lose, but there's got to be somebody to win as well. By the way, for those of you who are not familiar with the political history, Turkey has had a parliamentary system until 2017. The decision was made in 2007 to elect the president directly, and in 2017 we had a referendum to actually move from a parliamentary system to a presidential system. Since you're Americans, you will think, okay, presidential system, checks and balances, you know, separation of powers and stuff. We don't do these. Actually, I'm not going to get partisan. So this is a problem actually familiar to a lot of countries nowadays, where the executive really expands its power at the expense of the judiciary and or the legislature, and certainly tries to dominate the direction of the decisions of the judiciary. This is where we are today. And unfortunately for us, the new system has not really built an administrative structure and a structure of governance. And that is actually, that's what was reflected during the earthquake as well. So whatever if the opposition wins, they promise that we will go back to a parliamentary system, and rehabilitation of our institutions ought to be task number one.
So let's look at some of the critical issues that the Turkish government has faced, because one of the Erdogan aspirations, anyway, was that Turkey would become a major power in the region. And he's also, in many ways, very adeptly tried to balance his relationship with the West. Turkey is a member of NATO. As you mentioned before, it is a candidate, or has been a candidate, for the European Union, although it's not likely to be entered.
That's comatose now.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, so it's had relations with Russia even after Ukraine. And so there's a balancing act here that sometimes has put Erdogan in a difficult relationship with his allies, but nonetheless, Turkey's importance has maintained those relationships. So where does, for example, Turkey, as a NATO member, stand in relation to the war in Ukraine?
Honestly, if you listen to the Ukrainians, and I did, they think Erdogan has been on their side, in spite of the appearances and a lot of commentary, which I find rather useless, especially here, that Turkey is not behaving like an ally. For those of you who don't follow those things, Turkey controls the straits, the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, that control the passage from the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea. And the passage through the straits is regulated by a treaty that was signed in 1936 in the city of Montreux in Switzerland. And Turkey actually controls the passage and is responsible to implement the rules and regulations. So when the Russians invaded Ukraine, and called this a special operation. Turkey said that this was war. Therefore, the belligerent parties' ships could not cross the straits. And that, of course, immediately reduced Russia's ability to send battleships to the Black Sea. And that, of course, gave an incredible advantage to the Ukrainians, number one. In the initial stages of the war, when the Westerners were expecting Kiev to collapse, Turkish drones have helped the Ukrainians defend themselves, and only after that, Western, American particular, equipment and ammunition were sent their way. On the other hand, Turkey did not join the sanctions regime, tried to take advantage of the troubles that the Russian businesses and the state have found themselves in. Mr. Erdogan has very cordial relations with Mr. Putin, which of course gives the impression that Turkey has sided with Russia more so than with Ukraine. By and large, I think they managed that policy pretty well. Whenever Turkey tried to cross a line and violate the financial parts of the sanctions, the US Treasury made itself present and warned Turkey not to do those things. And a lot of European companies have tried to send goods to Russia through Turkey. And now this is also being, I think, more under control. So overall, Turkey had behaved as a neutral power, sometimes perhaps looking more favorable towards Russia, but primarily in favor of Ukraine. It never really accepted the annexation of Crimea. And it has condemned Russia's invasion, but nonetheless continued its relations. And by the way, I now have Russian neighbors in Istanbul. Every time I take a flight, there are Russians on my plane because Turkey is their only outlet. Turkey has not closed its airspace. It's a very lucrative line between Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other Russian cities and Istanbul. So if the Russians want to go anywhere in the world, they go through Turkey.
Are the weapons still being sold to the Ukrainians at the same time?
Drones?
Yeah.
The drones, yes. And I think there is other material that Turkey sends to the Ukrainians and shares information with them about the Black Sea.
And Turkey was also crucial to the negotiation over the shipment from the Black Sea of grains and other materials.
Absolutely. Twice Turkey convinced Putin to first sign the agreement and then to extend it. And the Russians just announced that after 18th of May, they will not extend it any further. Turkey also hosted the two meetings between Ukrainian and Russian principals have taken place in Turkey in the first few months of the war. And the latest, the head of the CIA, Bill Burns, and the head of the Russian intelligence actually met in Ankara, I think about 3 months ago. So in that sense, Turkey does play that part which befits a neutral country. And it is Mr. Erdogan's great aspiration to be the broker of a deal between Ukraine and Russia, but I guess that will not be.
But it does reflect this sort of tightrope walk.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it does reflect a tightrope.
And so this also carries over into other issues in the Middle East. Turkey has had, at various times over the last years, broken or bad relations with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, with the other Gulf states, or many of them. And some of these are now being repaired, with Syria in particular. Some of these are now being revived. Is that part of an election-related initiative to show Turkey's leadership, or something else?
You said that Turkey wanted to become a regional power in the Middle East. I think it wanted to be a hegemonic power. And I think that ambition now has fizzled out. It hasn't succeeded. So the repairing of relations with all the principal actors of the Middle East is part and parcel of a recognition that it didn't work and that we cannot really continue to have antagonistic relations with everyone around us. And that includes Syria, in whose civil war Turkey has actually actively participated.
And there are still Turkish
There are
troops
Turkish
in
troops.
Syria.
There had been 4 military operations inside Syria, and a 5th was being planned. And Mr. Erdogan announced that it was imminent, but he couldn't do it because he could not get the green light from the Russians, Iranians, Americans, and certainly the Syrians. And I think for this particular election, he thought he needed a big show, and he wanted to shake hands with Bashar al-Assad. And Bashar al-Assad is not interested until and unless Turkish troops leave Syrian territory. And that is not likely to happen anytime soon. Therefore, that meeting did not materialize, and Turkey could not really have another operation to the northeast of Syria, where it fights the extension of a Kurdish terrorist group, PKK. Its extension in Syria, PYD.
Which is an American ally at the same time.
And of course, that is one of the sticking points between the United States and Turkey. That is, PYD has been instrumental in fighting ISIS. They have lost about 10,000 people. The United States considers the PKK a terrorist organization, but does not consider PYD a terrorist organization, and Turkey begs to differ. And so that is part and parcel of Turkey's disagreement with particularly the CENTCOM.
But by the way, you can see why I needed all this explained to me when I started going to Turkey. And so, it's only gotten more complicated over the years. The same is true for relations with the European Union.
Yeah, I mean, look, Turkey's allies, in my judgment, had been very lazy. Partially because trust between Mr. Erdogan and all the leadership of the allies has declined considerably. I mean, in 2012, President Obama said that there were 5 leaders in the world that he actually communicated frequently and got their advice, and one of them was Tayyip Erdogan. From there to where we are today. But Tayyip Erdogan was the only person, I suppose, who could call President Trump when he was in the golf course and still speak with him. They had a special relationship as well. At any rate, but Europeans and Americans chose to have transactional relations with Turkey, partially because of lack of trust, but I think partially because of laziness. So I would think if the opposition does win and Turkey's tone will change, its relations with the rest of the world will be much more institutionalized. This foreign ministry will come back to the fore and all that. Then I think it's not just Turkey that will have to rethink and reconceptualize its relations with its allies, but I think the allies as well will have to think as to what kind of relation they want to have with Turkey, what kind of a language they should approach Turkey with. And I hope they do that. Otherwise, with their laziness, we may not get anywhere. And by the way, we talk a lot about, because of the Ukraine war, how the Atlantic Alliance is again being strengthened, NATO is its central institution, and how the strategic picture has changed and all that. Okay, the war starts, the Black Sea becomes an extraordinarily important theater, strategic theater. Eastern Mediterranean, where there are natural gas reserves, becomes an important strategic theater because Europeans no longer buy gas from Russia. And guess who's sitting between the Black Sea and the East Mediterranean? A country called Turkey, which is a member of NATO. So you really will have to think much more imaginatively. Both Turkey and the allies will have to think much more imaginatively as to how to reroute and reconceptualize the relations.
So Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu has said, as part of his campaign, that he's looking to improve these relationships.
Yeah.
He does not seem to have this kind of anti-Western, aspirational Western split in his politics that Erdogan does. Is this something that Erdogan acknowledges, or is anti-Western rhetoric still effective as a campaign tool in Turkey?
I'll start with the last part of your question. I think when the earthquake hit those provinces, our interior minister sent a message to the rest of the world and asked for help. And that it came from our interior ministry was in and of itself very newsworthy, I would say, because our most anti-American minister is our interior minister. And about 100 countries sent help. The teams they sent have been extraordinarily good, hardworking, and very serious and disciplined. And even, 3 countries with which Turkish population and Turkish politics do not necessarily have a good image, in Israel and Greece, with which Turkey has diplomatic relations, but also Armenia, with which Turkey does not have diplomatic relations, sent rescue teams. The border with Armenia was opened just on this occasion, and their ministers came to Turkey as well. All in all, the earthquake and the outpouring of help from the rest of the world, and particularly the Western allies and others, made it, in my view, almost impossible to actually conduct a campaign based on anti-Westernism. But the Turkish public is weary of the intentions of Western allies, the United States, some of the European countries. It doesn't trust them. But this is also a function of the way our politics had been constructed, particularly in the last 7 or 8 years. I expect that if the government changes, there will be a toning down. And as relations pick up again, and they pick up institutionally, I think we will see a relaxation of that sentiment.
Where do you see this issue of Turkey's place in the world, in the region, in relation to Europe, in relation to the great changes going on in the world, and also in relation to the political transformations towards populism and authoritarianism? Turkey seems to be in the middle of all of these sorts of things. Is this something that the population appreciates, or is it just exhausting, as it seems to be in other countries, our own included?
Well, in all countries, there is obviously only a segment of the population that has to think about those matters. But if after 20 plus years of AKP and Erdogan rule, the Turkish electorate manages to change governments through the ballot box, it will have given an incredibly important message to the rest of the world, in a way just like the Brazilians did when Mr. Lula actually managed to oust Mr. Bolsonaro at the ballot box. It will be taking power back from an Islamist government. It will be taking back power from an electorally authoritarian government. And that should send some messages to the rest of the world that, one, a well-organized, purposeful, energetic opposition can actually get that done under very adverse circumstances. And that all that talk about Islam and democracy not being compatible, Muslims not appreciating democracy and stuff, that will be seen as the bunk that it is. And that, I think, is going to be very good for the rest of the world as well. Otherwise, the rest of the world, most of the world is moving in the direction of less democracy and more authoritarianism. And you can put any adjective you want. It's illiberal democracy or electoral authoritarianism or competitive authoritarianism, hybrid this, hybrid that. But the trend is obvious. You look at Freedom House's record, and since 2005, democracy has been receding. So a country like Brazil, a country like Turkey actually proving this trend wrong is pretty important, in my judgment, for the fortification of democratic forces in the rest of the world as well. I value it a lot.
No, I'm sure that's true, but when you think of the Turkish electorate, and you say before, there's only a small percentage of the population that may be thinking about this in relation to the vote, it does seem to come down, as generally it does in elections, it comes down to the economy, it comes down to And now with the tragedy of the earthquake, it comes down to the government response, no?
Look, if it were really the pocketbook, he should have lost 70 to 30. Obviously, it isn't just economics. I mean, you also have it in your own country. I mean, you're part of the population in this. I mean, I teach a course on American politics as well, amateurishly, but I do. I read it. I read your debates. The economically more disadvantaged segments of the American population vote for a party whose economic policies actually work to their detriment. So voting maybe for middle classes is more related to pocketbook issues, but for some people it's not the only thing over which they make their decisions.
What's the cultural?
There is the cultural element is far more important than we thought before. And it's a combination of the economic and the cultural dimensions of people's identities and political reflections that determine their vote.
So I think it's important to underline, I mean, we as Americans understand what the terms of the culture war are in this country.
Oh, we do too.
But, you know, unfortunately, you have to do it. But you have your own terms of the culture war that you've actually described here.
Yeah.
Whether it's religious versus secular, whether it's Turkish versus Kurdish. I mean, these are all issues that are percolating through this electorate as the election comes.
Yeah, but you see, again, that's why I think the third cleavage, to put the projector on the third cleavage becomes important. Because
this is the democracy versus
this is
authoritarian.
democracy versus authoritarian one.
Yeah.
That it seems to me, I mean, obviously those overlap, those cleavages, but surveys indicate that for a variety of reasons, different segments of the Turkish population are not happy with the continuation of polarization and the reflection of that polarization through authoritarianism. So if the opposition prevails, this will be a clear sign as to where the Turks want to be. And on the centennial of the Turkish Republic, to the extent that the West itself has still democratic aspirations or their democracies are in danger, this gives a message, in my judgment, that actually the Republic succeeded. And that's a big challenge for us. We'll see how we will come of it.
Let's see if we have any questions from our audience. Gentleman here, wait for the mic, please.
Hi, thanks. Hello. Hi. Thanks for this talk. It was really interesting. I have two questions. I had a question about fake news and the role of fake news in this election, if it does play a role. And I also had a question about security concerns with the earthquake. You mentioned how there's Turkish troops in Syria, and there was also security concerns with Syria and Turkey too. So I wondered how this this earthquake affected that situation.
I'll start with the second, the security issue. There are enough Turkish soldiers in northern Syria, and by the way, to the best of my knowledge, the PYD only occasionally attacked soldiers inside Syria rather than in Turkish territory, although a couple of times, based on UN reports, they also attacked soldiers inside the country, but you don't expect a move from Syria towards Turkey militarily. Domestically, of course, Turkey is a country that was hit continuously, intermittently perhaps, but for a long period of time by terrorism. It was affected by terrorism. So in the next 3 weeks, will there be any terrorist incidents? I hope not, and I hope that our security forces are going to be vigilant about that. The first part of it was, fake news. Well, the expectation was for a long time that the Russians who wanted Erdogan to be re-elected would do their bid in favor of that. And there are plenty of fake news, I'm sure, but right now, especially one part of the population that doesn't trust the mainstream media gets all its news from the social media, which is another disaster. But at least you cannot really get past fake news for a long time among a certain segment of the population. But of course, that particular problem is a problem that plagues all democratic countries.
In the back, please. Just hang on for the mic. We have competing mics headed your way. Who's going to win the race? Geraldine wins.
Hi, thank you so much for your time. So in your mind, do you believe that an Erdogan loss automatically means a transition away from authoritarianism, or is there a feeling that it may be just a new flavor of the legacy that Erdogan left?
I think the former, partially because the pledge of the opposition is to revert back to a parliamentarian system. And that means the power will be more diffused, because in the current case we have an extraordinarily centralized power structure with no accountability and really no checks and balances and no true separation of powers. So that but I must say, to be truthful, probably in the first couple of years, in order to clean up some of the mess, whatever authority and powers the president has will be used. The thing is, and of course your question is a very legitimate one, well, what if the new president really likes all of that? I mean, what is he going to do? I would say, look, if we move in that direction, then you may find in the National Assembly itself an unlikely, or for the moment, an unthinkable coalition of all parties trying to change things because they don't want a repeat of that, because nobody will have the same kind of command over Turkish politics that Mr. Erdogan does have, because he's built it over the course of the last 21 years. So on that, I am fairly hopeful. That doesn't mean everything is going to be hunky-dory the next day. It won't be. I mean, like all countries, we have our own problems. There will be a lot of ambitions. You know, the newcomers to power would like to have their fingers in the honey dip, you know, for patronage and stuff. But a lot of the pressure on society and on the media and the judiciary in particular will have been lifted. That is more than enough for the initial stages for us to be protected against what you rightly suggested could happen.
And just to add as a footnote, the parliamentary elections also come on May 14th, and that's a single vote. It's not a two-round vote as the presidential vote is. Presidential will have a second round 2 weeks later if...
Which, of course, is another anomaly. I mean, they haven't really thought through this system because, I mean, if we go to a second round in the presidential one, who holds the majority in the parliament will probably have an impact on people's second round choices. But really, this system was not well thought through, I must say.
Yes.
It has a governance problem that is pretty serious.
Another question? Right there.
I'm Russian American, and every Russians who actively against the war, they see Erdogan as Putin's ally, which is true, I think. And if current opposition will take power after election, what are they any interested to change the Turkish position on the war between Russia and Ukraine, or they will maintain the current situation, especially because of geography relationship with Russia, which is important?
Thank you. The leader of the opposition pronounced his position on that. First of all, as I said, whatever you think of Erdogan and his relation to Putin and Russia, Turkey did not accept the annexation of Crimea, number one. Number two, Turkey has had serious military relations with Ukraine since before the annexation of Crimea. Thirdly, I told you that it implemented the Montreux Convention and stuff, and it condemned Russia for having invaded Ukraine. Those positions will not change. Neither will the Turkish position on having normal relations with Russia change. I really don't think the opposition, if it wins power, will necessarily join the sanctions regime. It will also not try to violate particularly the financial parts of the sanctions regime. And that was the message Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu sent to Putin. But the personal relation between the two leaders, that is not going to be there. Because occasionally they meet with only translators. There is nobody taking notes and stuff. We don't exactly know how those relations are being conducted because Turkish foreign policy has been over-personalized in the last 7 or 8 years. So returning to institutionalization means we will go back to the initial practices or the normal practices of Turkish foreign policy, and that already really ameliorates, if you will, the way these relations are seen. But I mean, antagonizing Russia is not in Turkey's interest, but it will not be. And it's not an ally of Russia either. Relations will change a little bit, but fundamentally they will stay probably similar, if not the same.
Let me ask one more.
Yeah.
You know, one of the markers of this decline in democratic investment by societies around the world is this issue as elections come as to whether or not the incumbent will give up power if he loses the election.
Yeah.
Is there talk of such things in Turkey? What is the expectation around Erdogan?
You know, in 1948, a CHP deputy, a professor of law by the name of Nihat Erim, said that Turkey wanted to be Little America. If that ambition still continues, and if 6th of January is a precedent, we should probably refuse that. Yeah, I know. Look, in September, I was here when I met people. The question was, are you really sure that there will be elections? It's a bit condescending. I mean, the answer was, yes, of course we will have elections because we've had elections for 72 years. And if there's anything about democracy that Turkish population genuinely and passionately cares about, it's the ballot box. We're all waiting for the ballot box to come, all right? Whatever it was going to come out of the ballot box remains to be seen. That's important. Secondly, I can see the concerns, but I think if there's a decisive victory, there will be no problem in turning over power. If there is no decisive victory, you can always appeal. The Electoral Council may make decisions that were similar to 2019, which were nonsensical. So we may find ourselves in a chaotic situation. But if there is a decisive win, and there will be observers, I personally will, there will be outside observers. I personally will be an observer at the ballot box. This will be my 4th. Tens of thousands of people will do that as well for electoral security. And if all indications are that we have held a fairly counted election and the outcome is a decisive one, I really don't see either a Trump or a Bolsonaro repeat performance in the country.
Well, as you have heard, it's really a fascinating place, brilliantly analyzed. Please join me in thanking Soli Ozel.